today in this webinar. For us at WOBSE, it's a very important aspect of our work to engage with and understand the many tens of thousands of years long history of management of the land by the Indigenous people, the First Nations of Western Australia, and acknowledge their custodianship of this land as that we work today alongside them to protect. Today's webinar, we're looking at renewable energy and the challenges and opportunities for biodiversity as we scale up the renewable energy generation globally. And we're really privileged to be joined by Leon Ben-Nun from the Biodiversity Consultancy in Cambridge, one of the authors of a recent UN report on renewable energy and biodiversity challenges. Before I hand over to Leon, I will introduce WOBSE a little bit. Those of you who are not at your first webinar will already have met me. I'm Owen Nevin. I'm the Chief Executive here at WOBSE, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. And as you feed questions through in the chat function, I'll summarize those and bring those into a discussion with Leon at the end of the meeting. WOBSE is a joint venture of 4 universities, 4 government departments, the Commonwealth Science Industry Research Organisation, CSIRO, and the Western Australian Museum. We work with community, government, industry researchers, regulators and funders to create opportunities for meaningful, positive biodiversity change here in the state of Western Australia. We focus our efforts around those wicked problems. It's sometimes an overused term, but I think it really captures what we do. The areas where many stakeholders, many inputs and outcomes all converge around a problem or an opportunity, and we try to bring together the best research with the best on the ground expertise, facilitate the sharing of that knowledge to gain outcomes for the state. Very much an end user led organization, hearing from people on the ground what their knowledge gaps and knowledge needs are, working with our research collaborators to develop science programs that fill those knowledge gaps, and looping back to ensure that those end user stakeholders get the information that they need. So a very collaborative research approach. We produce a range of publications and outputs and work to then implement these programs of research, or prioritized research or on-ground application. Today's webinar is addressing a very current issue, the expansion of renewable energy, very dispersed, very wide-ranging impacts globally of renewable energy generation. And Leon is joining us from Cambridge today to talk through some of the case studies and findings of his recent report. Leon's a globally experienced biodiversity scientist who's worked in that policy and practice interface across many roles, including with BirdLife International and the National Museum in Kenya before his current role. And without too much more from me, I will hand over to Leon to take us into the meat of today's topic. So Leon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Owen, and thanks for the chance to talk to you all today. It's really a pleasure. Let me see if I can share my screen. Hope that's showing up okay.
Yep, we got that.
Great. So thank you once again for the introduction. So I'm going to talk today about some of the challenges and opportunities of scaling up wind and solar, based on TBC's own project experience, but also work we've been doing with IUCN and other partners in the last few years. to try to produce guidance on this issue. So in terms of what the talk will cover, I'll talk a bit about the context, the imperative for upscaling wind and solar, and issues around enabling a nature positive energy transition, so general scene setting around climate change and renewables, in particular wind and solar. Look at the potential biodiversity impacts of wind and solar upscaling, and then look at how we might be able to deal with those by applying the mitigation hierarchy, and looking in more detail then about how we can avoid impacts through strategic planning and screening, what can be done to minimize impacts of projects, and the opportunities for enhancement and potentially, if needed, for offsets. And then just to round off with some of the things that often aren't thought about but are quite important in terms of the post-construction monitoring and the end-of-life planning. I'll be looking at this both from the policy, so the regulator, government, finance end, but also from the project end, developer, implementation of projects. And just to stress, it'll be a global overview based especially on TBC's experience in emerging markets. I haven't worked that much in Australia, not on renewables certainly, so I don't have all the Australian context for this. I'm sure that those on the call will be able to supply that through questions and discussions afterwards. So the imperative for upscaling is fairly clear. All the pathways that have been mapped out for how we can actually get to net zero and meet global climate commitments by 2050 show that there need to be a very deep electrification based almost entirely on renewables. And in those renewables, wind and solar have by far the biggest opportunity and the overall least impact for scaling up. They will likely be the predominant sources. Obviously, to be sustainable, this has to be combined with a range of other policy approaches, including increased energy efficiency and reductions in overall demand where electrification already is there. There's going to be a greater demand across the globe as a whole as emerging markets, developing countries electrify and develop their economies. We want to try and make sure that demand as a whole per capita goes down. And this deep electrification, as I say, has been a central feature of these pathways. This gives a sense of the kind of steps that are needed. The recent IEA publication on net zero by 2050, really very large additional annual solar and wind in the next 10 years, moving towards overall net zero emissions soon after that in advanced economies and globally by 2040. By 2050, having over 2/3 of electricity generation globally of this larger pie, because there'll be more electricity happening to start with, from solar, PV and wind. It's important, of course, that this energy transition accounts for nature, and we can't just do it without thinking about the natural world. And this has been a clear feature of recent climate change discussions, including at COP26 with the Glasgow Pact, that there's a real need now to integrate the biodiversity and climate tracks to make sure that energy pathways address greenhouse gas emissions, but don't undermine conservation goals. And that's important for lots of reasons, not least because not considering nature could undermine climate progress itself. Analyses show that if we just scale up renewables by putting them in the best places where the resource is greatest, without thinking about the impacts on nature, that could seriously undermine our climate mitigation efforts because of the carbon it would actually release. So many good reasons for tying these strands together, but one has to say that hasn't really happened and is still a work in progress at the moment. So wind and solar are often thought of or talked about as green technologies, but is that the case? We know they have impacts. If we look at a life cycle assessment, and this is work we've been doing with WWF, how to map out a nature positive transition to net zero. In fact, solar PV, photovoltaic and concentrated solar, onshore and offshore wind do overall have much lower impacts on biodiversity than other forms of renewables like hydro or geothermal, or certainly bioenergy, and of course than fossil fuels. You can see the comparative life cycle results in terms of natural land transformation, ecotoxicity in the middle there. Those circles are different sizes and colors. Not that renewables don't have impacts, but the impacts are generally smaller and they're often more manageable. So the bottom rows show the potential to address those impacts at project level and also potentially to achieve nature positive outcomes through various interventions around the project, which I'll talk more about later in this talk. Message being that these technologies definitely are greener than the alternatives, but they don't necessarily come without impacts if they're not carefully managed. And I should stress this is an average picture. So obviously particular projects can be more or less good or bad depending on where they are and the exact context of how they're implemented. But the overall message seems to be clear that yes, renewables, and in particular wind and solar, are greener than the alternatives, and wind and solar are greener than the alternatives in the renewables field, which is probably good news given that they're the ones which we're expecting to scale up. Again, in terms of context, just to stress that there's a number of pieces around simply upscaling these technologies that need to be in place. For a start, technologies are changing and evolving. So we expect to see more emphasis on new technologies like floating wind and solar in the future. More about that a little bit later too. Because wind and solar are also intermittent sources of power, have to be combined with storage solutions. And these have their own impacts and challenges and are still very much in development. So there'll need to be new storage solutions that work. Green hydrogen is one obvious candidate. There's a number of others as well, but these also need massive upscaling and development in the next 10 years. There's a lot of scope for decentralizing energy, so we don't need to focus just on utility scales, but also localized mini grids or rooftop solar and the like. And there's also scope to reduce impacts on nature by energy sharing. By interconnecting between countries, we can optimize resource use and minimize the impacts. And of course, there are lots of political issues associated with this in terms of energy security, etc. But that is the best way to try to reduce the impacts on the planet. And a very important piece that, again, at the moment is not that well looked after in renewables is to move towards a circular economy so that we can recycle and use materials and minimize the waste stream and the need to extract lots of new minerals to make this transition happen. That's a really key element. So these unintended impacts of wind and solar do need careful management. I've mentioned that they're going to take a much greater share than they do at the moment of a bigger electricity pie in the future. That means essentially quadrupling the installed capacity in the coming decade. That's an enormous amount of new installations. We're starting to see this happen now. The kind of project work the TBC's engaged on, things are really scaling and ramping up in some places. And within the next 5 years, we're going to see some very, very big solar farms in particular. And that means space on land or on water, estimated to be between 500,000 kilometers squared by 2050, depending where things go. That's a large chunk of land. I'm from Kenya, which is a middle-sized African country, and 500,000 kilometers squared is about the size of Kenya. So we're looking at fitting in one or two Kenyas in the existing land space of the world, which we know is already fully occupied either by diminishing nature or by people in cities or using the land for various other productive purposes. So there's a big challenge to work out where these things fit. And they come along with increased demand for certain minerals that will be needed to support the transition, to build the turbines and the panels, and the storage that goes along with this, in particular lithium at the moment, and graphite, cobalt, and nickel. Those elements may change as technologies change in the future, but one way or the other, there'll be a lot of new mining that's needed. So it's clear that if not well managed, the impacts on nature could undermine both climate and biodiversity goals. And we really have to make sure that this upscaling isn't at the expense of natural habitat and threatened species, or indeed other elements of nature that are important for sustainability of our planet. The good news is that there are effective mechanisms for mitigation. I've mentioned the report with IUCN, which I'll come back to a number of times in this talk and draw from. But those need to be applied effectively from the earliest planning stages. And that's a key message of this talk, is that you don't do this as an afterthought, but from the very first step of embarking on the process. And that means that there's important steps for governments and financiers to take in terms of encouraging or requiring good standards, good practice standards, making sure that our approaches align with national global biodiversity targets and contribute to nature positive outcomes, and that the overall policy framework for climate and biodiversity align with each other, and that low impact pathways are encouraged by policy. And this little diagram at the bottom, which I've adapted from a presentation by the Nature Conservancy, Joe Kiesecker, just shows in simple terms what that means, that you're moving from considering energy generation from fossil fuels or higher impact renewables to utility scale renewables on wind and solar, rather on natural lands, to trying to put those facilities on converted or degraded lands, to emphasize where possible distributed and small scale solutions which have less impact, and to make sure there's an emphasis also on energy efficiency, conservation and upgrades of grids to avoid wastage. So you make the best use of what you're producing and don't need to produce more than is required. So what are the impacts potentially of these new technologies or these existing technologies upscaled in a very large way? What are we talking about? Well, there's a number of different flavors of wind and solar. Established ones, photovoltaic panels that we're all familiar with, but also concentrated solar in some parts of the world has been developed as a parallel technology, where you have arrays or panels that focus the sun onto essentially a focal point that heats a liquid and produces power that way. So it's a slightly different approach. Rather than turning the sunlight into electricity directly, you use a more traditional generation through heat. Onshore wind, again familiar, and offshore wind, which is confined at the moment to a few parts of the world, but likely to scale up very dramatically in many other places in the future. Then emerging technologies, I mentioned floating solar panels, or photovoltaic as it's sometimes called, which again is a fairly new technology, not that much explored. We don't understand the impacts very well, but there are potentially positives and negatives of using, for example, existing reservoirs or canals to generate power as well. This can have benefits ecologically or downsides. Floating offshore wind, where we tether the turbines to the seafloor rather than having a fixed pillar, that allows the turbines to be out in much deeper water, beyond 60 meters depth or so, up to maybe even a kilometer's depth in the future. And these are very big turbines. There's a lot of wind out there. There are challenges, of course, in the design and also in getting the electricity back to the shore. Potentially, that's an enormous resource that is likely to be much more exploited in future years, with its whole kind of interesting stream of challenges, engineering and biodiversity ones alongside it. We don't understand those challenges from the biodiversity view very well yet. And then so-called unconventional wind. So there's the horizontal axis turbines we're familiar with are the standard that's been developing as an industry for many years now. There's many other designs that are possible. You can see a picture of one there. There's lots of other interesting turbine approaches, including pillars that wobble, etc. These are quite exciting because in some cases they seem to offer good potential for generation in urban sites, for example, and generation that doesn't involve much risk of collision for birds and bats, which is a problem for traditional turbines. The main challenge is that they're still not very well developed. So it's highly unlikely that we're going to see these scaling up in the next 5 or 10 years at least, maybe after that. So we are going to have to contend with, better or worse, upscaling of traditional wind turbines on land, near shore, and increasingly further offshore too with floating wind. The mining impacts are very important to stress because they're often overlooked. They exist already, but they're going to become much bigger in future. We know a lot about the impacts of mining. We also know how to control those, but mining can have quite serious impacts, both in terms of the footprint and the management of toxic waste, but also indirectly through all sorts of other issues around induced access and wider disturbance. So it's really important to try to up the standards in terms of how mines are planned and controlled as well. And just to highlight a few of the things that may be coming along at larger scale, lithium extraction, which is concentrated in a few rather unusual habitats like these salt lakes, which are unique and very hard to replace or restore. And then the whole issue of deep ocean mining, which I won't go into today. It's highly controversial, seen by some as a source of an almost limitless supply of these important minerals, but also with potentially very uncertain impacts that could potentially be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to restore, and could, again, potentially, we don't really know, also have big effects on planetary systems. So seen as really quite high risk. So getting into the technologies in more detail, this is a picture of a typical photovoltaic project and its connections to the wider world. Concentrated solar power looks different, but has quite similar impacts. The key thing with solar power is it takes quite a lot of land. So you have the potential, if they're put in the wrong places, of losing natural habitat, of fragmenting the landscape, or creating barriers for species to move. Panels need to be cleaned. Concentrated solar power in particular can be quite water hungry, but there are ways of mitigating that. That can be quite a problem in arid areas. Obviously, lots of solar installations are in sunny places that are dry with not much cloud cover. And that's where many big plants are planned in the future. And if those use lots of water, including drawing on existing aquifers and groundwater, for example, that can have quite disruptive effects on ecology. And throughout all these different technologies, I will stress that the potential impacts of transmission lines and distribution lines too, but those aren't usually so much part of the solar and wind projects. To evacuate your electricity to where it needs to go, to an existing substation, for example, you will usually or often need new power lines, and those can pose a serious risk of collisions to birds in particular, which often isn't thought about that much or addressed at the moment. Onshore wind, again, we have the footprint of the turbines or the wind farm. The individual turbine footprint is quite small. So they don't take a lot of space in terms of the land they're sitting on, but the wind farm as a whole can be quite extensive. Offshore ones in particular can be very large. That can lead to an effective degradation of habitat. So even if you aren't actually converting much habitat, a number of species may not like to use the area afterwards. Ground nesting birds, for example, some seabirds, some marine mammals will avoid the turbine areas. Others might be attracted in some cases, so there's a big ecological change. But the biggest impacts may often be in the air. So this is quite different from conventional projects where we're focused on the footprint on what's happening on the ground or in the water. What's happening in the air is an important consideration for wind power. And the classic problem is bird and bat collisions with both the turbines and potentially the transmission lines. And again, displacement and barriers from mobile things in the air. And the same for offshore wind, but we have some additional things to think about because of the specifics of the marine situation. So inevitably, when you put in these turbines, whether they're floating or fixed, there'll be ecological changes to the seabed and the hydrology. These need to be thought about really in terms of the overall seascape and how they influence a whole range of things in terms of currents, sedimentation, and also the distribution of animals, especially the prey species for marine megafauna. They do create habitat in the sense that they are providing new substrate. So the turbine towers are colonized by many species, can even be refuges for some species, and that can be positive. It's certainly a change for better or for worse. There are potentially quite significant construction impacts, especially the issue of noise when you're piling in these turbine bases, and ongoing issues around vessel collisions as you maintain the turbines too. Marine mammals in particular are susceptible to this, but other species as well. And there's debate about the significance of electromagnetic effects from undersea cables. So typically you'd have a cable going out from your offshore turbines to the shore. That's that orange box on the left there is the shore substation. And that creates an electromagnetic effect to which some marine species, especially certain fish, are quite sensitive. I have to say there's not a lot of evidence that this is a significant problem at the moment, but the jury is out. It needs more study. And then in the air, although collisions do occur, and I've put both birds and bats down there because perhaps surprisingly, there's a lot of bat activity around some offshore wind farms, especially on migration routes. We think of bats as being very much confined to the land, but they also spend time, some species, over sea, either foraging near shore or moving to on their migratory routes, and they can be attracted to and collide with wind turbines. But probably a much bigger problem for most seabirds, which are quite good at avoiding turbines, as far as we can tell from the limited data available. As we do more studies, we get more information on this, and increasingly it shows that they're actually very good, by and large, at not colliding with the turbines. But many of these species will be displaced because they're not keen to enter the wind farm. That can have effects on their foraging areas. They may lose areas to forage. They may have to move long distances around wind farms, especially where there are many wind farms in one area. And there can also be attractions. So species may be attracted to the turbines for various reasons. There can be convenient perches. They can also be a food source because of the refuge effect for marine invertebrates and fish around their bases. So it's quite a complex picture that can be both plus and minus. It's important, again, to stress that when it comes to collision in particular, not all species are at risk in the same way. So wind turbines are quite specific about which kinds of birds and bats they kill. The birds at most risk include things like large soaring birds, vultures especially, but other birds of prey like large eagles and also storks are known to collide with them quite a lot. Migratory species are a particular risk because they cover long distances and may encounter many turbines, but also because of their behavior sometimes. There's evidence that some gulls and tern species do collide with turbines offshore, though I think that is quite a limited effect. And with bats, different kinds of bats are more or less susceptible. Those that forage in the open air rather than in wooded areas and that migrate long distances tend to be more prone to collisions. Transmission lines, there's an overlap, but we see particular birds like bustards and cranes, again, storks, eagles, and vultures to some extent, that are big and heavy with high wing loading. They can't maneuver their way that easily, do tend to collide with transmission lines. And the key threat here is the thin earth wire that runs along the top of these transmission lines. It can be very hard for birds to see in time. And the same with congregatory water birds, for example, flamingos, which fly at night when there are transmission lines close to their foraging areas and they fly out across the transmission lines, we see large numbers of fatalities. Displacement varies a huge amount. Birds of prey do seem to be displaced from turbines quite a bit. Migrants also, and some seabird species, others are attracted. Also birds of open country like grassland birds, which aren't keen on foraging or nesting around tall structures, which they see as potentially a source of predation risk. And I've mentioned the issues around vessel collisions and noise and water use in arid areas. So in terms of the implications of biodiversity, there's a very wide range of species that are affected, but the responses and the risks vary a lot. So it's certainly not a one size fits all. You need to think quite carefully about what the implications are in particular contexts. Unfortunately, although we have a lot of information for the North Temperate Zone, the US and Europe in particular, we have limited information on species risk for elsewhere in the world. We can make analogies. We can assume that species like large eagles that are vulnerable in the US may be vulnerable in Africa or Australia too, for example. But it's much harder for some things like fruit bats, which don't really occur in the parts of the world where there are wind turbines already, or for other bat species that don't have analogues in those areas, to work out what the risks might be. Wind turbines will kill species. They kill a very wide range of species, but that doesn't mean that those impacts are necessarily problematic at the population level. And I think, again, it's important to think about weighing up what we see happen at a wind turbine, because those fatalities will be recorded and monitored if the farm is doing its job properly, versus the invisible mortalities caused by, for example, coal, oil and gas, hydro, etc., where we don't see what's happening, but there are still very major impacts on nature. So because some birds have been killed doesn't necessarily mean there's a significant conservation problem, but as the number of renewables ramps up, in some landscapes we have many, many wind farms, and same with some seascapes, the impacts may add up across those different wind farms. They may, or indeed solar farms in terms of displacement and habitat loss. They may interact with each other, so become worse because they're kind of synergistic, and may also be better addressed collectively across developments rather than piece by piece. So there's really a key part of the puzzle here around looking at cumulative impacts, which again is very much a work in progress, hasn't been properly addressed yet in most parts of the world. The likeliest impacts are going to be on species that are quite prone to collisions or to habitat fragmentation challenges. And those will be things that are threatened, wide-ranging in terms of having large movements, a large home range, or migratory, and especially where these have demographic features that make them vulnerable. So the classic is vultures, for example, old-world vultures, which mostly in steep decline for other reasons. They're long-lived, they're slow breeding, and they fly looking down, so they don't see the turbines. And so the additional demographic pressure from fatalities at wind turbines can potentially be a big challenge to vulture populations, and the same for bustards on transmission lines. There's a small number of species where wind is likely to be a significant problem, where we need to do our very best to make sure the impacts don't happen in the first place. Just as an example, the Great Indian Bustard, which might be, we hope not, of course, the first bird extinction from poorly planned renewable energy. It's a species that was already in trouble, as many bustards are. They're large, slow-moving ground birds. They're hunted. They need large home ranges, so they often suffer when habitats are fragmented or disturbed. So the Great Indian Bustard was already in trouble, but now its main stronghold in the Thar Desert is being crisscrossed by new transmission lines. There's a whole spider's web of lines going up for new wind and solar energy, again, without clear, careful planning that could have reduced those impacts. And so the threat from collisions is now adding to many other existing threats. Current estimates are that there's around 100 birds left in the world, which is a scarily small number, and around 18 of those are currently being killed in fatal collisions with transmission lines every year. That points in only one direction, which is extinction in the near future. There's actually been some court action, some legal activity around this, and there's been an order that diverters should be put on the existing lines. They don't work too well for busters, unfortunately, but they're better than nothing. And the future ones should be buried, but this is being challenged in court by the Indian government, and it still might be too little too late. So we want to avoid this kind of thing recurring. There are ways to mitigate and prevent these impacts rather than just accepting that we're going to lose species or important habitats because we have to upscale renewables. It's not a given that these impacts have to happen. How do we prevent them? Well, by applying the mitigation hierarchy in short, to avoid, reduce, restore and offset impacts. The emphasis being on those first two preventive measures. That's why it's a hierarchy, because you focus on avoiding and reducing to start with. And that's what this practical guidance from IUCN and TBC is aimed at. This is aimed at developers, at project implementers, but also has a lot of messages for government in terms of broader policy and for banks. And I'll have a link at the end, but you can find it easily on the IUCN website online. And it's designed as a simple guidebook and framework to how you can try to prevent these impacts happening. What does that look like in a typical project? Now, the key thing, as I'll talk about in a minute, is where you put it. So your siting will prevent a lot of potential impact. You can then design and redesign the project to reduce impacts further. You can restore any impacts on the habitat on site. And if you really have to, you can offset any residual impacts and also take measures to enhance on-site or proactively improve things off-site, which, all going well, will get you to a position of no net loss or preferably net gain for the biodiversity that you're focusing on. So the really key piece for renewables is this first step of avoiding impacts through strategic planning and screening. And it's clear that where you put these installations is key. I mentioned this study by Joseph Kiesecker and team, looking at the potential impacts on nature if you simply look at putting installations where the resource is greatest. Obviously, you need a minimal level of resource for it to be economically viable, but that doesn't mean you have to go for the places where the resource is best, because those may coincide with important nature as well. This shows the potential per country losses of threatened species if you were to go for the best resource scenario without any other considerations. And the same with the green map at the top right there in terms of the total natural habitat loss. Fortunately, there is a lot of converted land that could be used, around 17 times what's needed at a global scale. That's the map on the bottom right there, also from the TNC team. Now, as I mentioned before, because land is converted or degraded doesn't mean it's not being used or hasn't got plans in place for it. So it's not that that land is just waiting for wind and solar to sit on it, but it's probably a much better option to try to use it and try and make sure you don't displace the impacts elsewhere, of course, than to go for a natural site that will entail immediate biodiversity destruction. Overall, the potential for wind and solar worldwide is huge, so there's plenty of the resource. And that does make it a lot easier than with some other technologies like hydro or geothermal, for example, and certainly oil and gas extraction, to work out where you put things, because you have a lot more choice. So although you may not be choosing the absolutely best places, there's plenty of wind and solar that can be used at an economic return in many parts of the world. And you can see here, this is just a map showing the proportion of the land area that you need to meet all current energy demand from solar alone. It's a somewhat unrealistic projection, but just gives you a sense that there's an awful lot of the resource out there in many parts of the world. So the key thing, as I say, is to try to plan upstream to avoid the impacts. So by taking a step back and thinking about where you put things, doing that strategic planning, you can do a huge amount to prevent impacts on biodiversity. Sensitivity mapping is one element of this, that's often applied. It's essentially a way to identify where sensitive biodiversity features are, work out which ones you want to avoid impacting, and then work out what that means in terms of constraining your development and where you want to put things. Spatial planning is a more integrated approach that can include sensitivity mapping, but it's trying to consider a whole range of different factors where there may be win-wins or trade-offs, economic issues, technical issues, social issues, as well as environmental factors, to work out where you prefer to put your developments, balancing all these things together. It can be part of or linked to strategic environmental assessments, not necessarily quite the same thing. And it also needs to consider cumulative impacts as a way of checking that you're not overdoing it and potentially causing big impacts by having lots and lots of small impacts piled on together. This is really helpful for developers, as well as obviously for achieving broader policy goals, because you can work out where you want to put things, reduces uncertainties about risks, uses conflict with stakeholders. It makes it easy to get hold of the finance. It reduces the regulatory process costs and transaction costs. And it can also be very effective in reducing the cost of assessment and mitigation. And all going well, if the system is set up right, it can speed up permitting and overall reduce investment risk significantly. So it's a good thing to do. It's still a bit patchy. So many parts of the world have done this, but others have not yet. Here's an example of sensitivity mapping for solar in the Mojave Desert, where they've looked at the ecological intactness, essentially, of the landscape and worked out which the best bits are to put solar plants on, trying to avoid those dark green and, as far as possible, the light green areas too. Work that we've done with partners in Kenya for USAID and Power Africa, where I'm showing this one to demonstrate that even in a fairly data poor environment, because most African countries haven't got good data on species distribution, we were able to use what was available, which was range maps refined for area of habitat or suitable habitat, the available information from eBird records, etc., and also importantly some tagging data from satellite tagged vultures, which are a key priority group that helped us to work out where the vultures were spending most of their time. The coloured areas on the right are the economic wind areas above a threshold of wind intensity, and the brighter the red, the higher the risk. So again, it's clear there's quite large areas of low risk. Unfortunately, those are not where wind farms have been planned so far in Kenya, but the hope is that we can encourage government developers to move away from the higher risk areas and into those yellower squares to get good wind, but not impact biodiversity too much. South Africa has done a couple of iterations of SEAs to identify renewable energy development zones, looking, as I say, at technical, environmental and socioeconomic criteria, targeting brownfield, and looking at what they're calling enabling as well as features as well as constraints, but trying to make sure that sensitive features, such as protected areas or bird and bat roosts and feeding sites, are protected. So the enabling features are both the resources, but also the potential for economic advancement. There's a strong social lens to this. They've looked at where wind and solar power would have the most potential for uplifting an area's economic development. And on top of that, they then overlaid a map of environmental constraints. So you mask out the unsuitable areas, and what's left is a win-win for economic wind and solar, social development, and low impacts on biodiversity. Offshore, similar with the Crown Estate in the UK, which has done some very substantial work on offshore planning. Again, looking at the technical resources and engineering constraints, but also the sensitivities, and consulting a broad range of stakeholders. And in the end, that's led to focusing on a subset of the areas that were originally identified. The rest have been ruled out for various reasons, including environmental ones and issues of cumulative impacts, to make sure that the whole sea is not full of turbines, which could have major effects on some seabirds, for example. We're working with the World Bank as part of a big project looking at scaling up offshore wind, part of the Energy Sector Management System Program, or ESMAP. So one of the first country studies has just been published for the Philippines, and again, a similar approach. You can see that again, this roadmap is looking in broad terms at where the economic potential is, what the other constraints might be. There's a number of factors we've looked at in terms of the environmental constraints. Again, the information is somewhat limited, but this is the best that can be done for now, and it gives a good picture as to where you want not to develop. And you can see the map on the right. The polygons in black are the proposed potential offshore wind development zones and how those are fitting in with the environmental restrictions. So the good news is that there are areas that look like being fairly low impact for biodiversity that could still be good for offshore wind. And TNC in India has done a lot of work with the SiteRight tool to try to look at where wind and solar should go. It's a very complex landscape with many different pressures on the land. There's potential to impact people's livelihoods as well as biodiversity if you're putting things in the wrong places. So they've been looking carefully at how to de-risk that process by focusing on landscape level connectivity, potential for restoration, as well as these other issues around agricultural land and existing biodiversity. So it's looking at a landscape level plan for where you put your wind and solar, maximize the benefits and minimize the disadvantages. A simple concept can be quite hard to apply in practice, and you don't often get to a single objective right answer. But if you involve the stakeholders from all sides, you come up with something that's going to be a lot better than simply piling in and doing it without a thoughtful approach. So that's the spatial planning side. Risk screening is still important to do whether there's a spatial plan or not. That ensures that you've accounted for biodiversity risks in your early project decision making. Risk screening is generally focused on a particular site, so it's not telling you about the broader landscape and the potential for other sites that you could be choosing instead, though you can often risk screen for several sites at once. Essentially, it's a simple desktop exercise that draws on the data that are available, sometimes with additional expert opinion or input, and assesses them against particular criteria or specifications like IFC Performance Standard 6, for example. And just to mention one of the tools that's commonly used for this, which is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT, that contains a number of key global data sets, protected areas, key biodiversity areas, relative threatened species. That doesn't always give you what you need in terms of collision risk, for example, but it's an excellent starting point for assessing your biodiversity risk that you can then supplement with other data sets. And this is really useful as a way of getting insights into what the risks might be and what you need to do to explore them further in your next step of survey and assessment work. Just to summarize the overall process, we have these three elements that fit together: sensitivity mapping that feeds into SCA or strategic planning and provides information for understanding risk. You have the early planning and site selection that's done at a large scale and can be undertaken or led by various agencies. Often sensitivity maps are led by conservation NGOs that hold much of the data, like BirdLife, for example. Often it's government agencies or banks that lead on the strategic assessment. And the risk screening itself will be a developer-led process that feeds into project design and in due course the environmental and social impact assessment. As I mentioned, risk screening can help you to scope your field surveys, so it's very useful in focusing down what you need to look at rather than just having a general scattergun approach. It's important for wind power in particular that surveys should first of all match the risk to make sure that you're addressing the features that need attention, but also they should be sufficiently long, so there can be big seasonal variations, especially in how things are moving around in the air. And to account for that, you need to look at least a full year's data, often longer if the risks are higher and the variation is bigger. And it's important also to consider the wider geographic scopes and not just the project footprint itself, what's happening around it in the landscape that could cause additional risk. Can help work out where you can avoid things further. So you might be able to identify ridges, for example, that are used by soaring birds and where you can put turbines back from the ridge to avoid collision risk, and also minimization requirements you can plan for in your project planning and your economic forecast. And of course, it would be ideal, this doesn't often happen at the moment, but the ideal is that where you have a landscape that's designated for wind and solar development, different projects and developers talk to each other and share information so that you coordinate the approach across the landscape. This gives you a much better picture of the baseline, allows you to compare results and handle cumulative impacts much more effectively. So how about measures to minimize the impacts? Once again, coming back to mining, we know a lot about minimization of mining impacts, but it's key that as wind and solar upscales, we really try to ensure strong environmental criteria, upscale mining across the world, and improve the circular economy requirements for materials as an underlying policy piece, and then to try and make sure that mines do follow good international practice and minimize their impacts on the ground. Onshore wind, I guess the bottom line is there's not a huge amount you can do in some cases to minimize impacts, so avoidance is far, far better. But there are some effective approaches in some cases. So in where you have birds or bats of high risk passing through at certain times of the year or in certain conditions, it's possible to curtail it or shut down the turbines. With bats, obviously that's usually at night. So when the wind speed's low, the bats tend to be much more active. And it's been shown, at least in North America and Europe, that you can get quite effective reduction in fatalities by just not having your turbine starting to turn until the wind speeds are above, say, 5, 6, or 7 kilometers per second. Meters per second. You can install acoustic deterrents to try to deter bats. Those have mixed results so far, quite species specific. Again, for much of the world, we haven't got that much done yet on testing these for the bats that are there, especially in the tropics, but it's advancing. Where you have birds like migratory soaring birds, for example, or eagles or vultures, you can keep an eye on them, and if they're at risk of colliding with the turbine, you can get the turbine shut down temporarily. That can be done through observers, or a mixture of observers and radar or other automated systems. So there's been a lot of advance in the last few years in trying to combine radar systems with cameras and with, in the case of bats, heat sensors that allow automated detection of when species at risk are around and then shutting the turbines down for a period. Those are still quite experimental and not widely implemented. They're also quite expensive, but the expectation will be that in 5 years or so, they'll be a lot more robust, and that we probably will see this as a standard in many new wind farms where there's priority species to worry about. It tends to work better, this approach, when you have particular bursts of activity. So typically for migrants passing through at certain times of the year. It's more difficult when there's continuous activity on site, though that can be done depending on the species. And one interesting but so far not widely applied approach is to paint one turbine blade black. It may seem very strange that birds, which often have excellent eyesight, fail to see the turning blades. So how can an eagle spot a mouse that's half a kilometer below it in a field but not see the turbine? Seems to be puzzling. Birds' visual systems are different to ours. They have a different sense of contrast in particular, and it seems, although we obviously can't get inside their heads fully, that they often see the turbines as a blur without really being able to distinguish the blades. So the theory is that painting one blade will make it easier for birds to detect the turbine and avoid it. That seems to work really well in the one place it's been tried, in Norway, where it's been effective at preventing fatalities of white-tailed eagles. It's being trialed now in 1 or 2 other places in Europe, and we'll see how that goes. There are engineering challenges. TBC had hoped to get some of our projects in Africa to try this out, but there's concerns that the blade might heat up too much and fragment or explode. So there's clearly some engineering work to do on the mechanics of black blades or other colored blades before we can implement this more effectively, more widely. But it is one of the more promising of the limited impact mitigation measures that are out there for minimization. So an example from Kenya, which I've been working on for a while, 60 megawatt facility in southern Kenya. It's a savanna habitat, woodland and grassland, where we have pastoralist landowners and lots of wildlife too. That means that there's a constant supply of seasonal variation up and down of livestock and wildlife carcasses, which attracts vultures. And these vultures are now critically endangered. 2 species spend a lot of time foraging over the site and potentially at very high risk. And here we've implemented a completely low-tech solution. So we have 8 teams of 2 persons up these observation towers every day when the turbines are turning, all day long, watching out for vultures and some other priority species. And if they see the birds at risk approaching a wind turbine, then the turbine is shut down through a message to the control center, and they can shut down within about 40 seconds. So far that's been quite effective in avoiding any vulture fatalities. It's only been running for 9 months, so we still have to wait and see how it goes in the longer term. But it's quite an exercise with around 30 staff employed overall. In fact, I think now there are 34 people in the team. It's been great at creating local community jobs and community awareness, which is really important for the other part of the mitigation, which is keeping the site clear of carcasses to avoid contracting the birds in the first place, but probably not something that you can implement in, say, Europe, where it's much more expensive to employ people at the moment. So what you do at a particular site will be a balance of what's going to work versus what technology is available, how much it costs, and what your local context and needs are from the social side too. Offshore wind, we had to consider the risks to marine species in particular. Avoidance by scheduling, as it's called, is quite important. If you know there are marine mammals around at certain times of the year, you try to make sure that you do your construction when they're not there. Measures to minimize noise, which are well established for other kinds of offshore work already. So there are some quite well established approaches for doing that, although it can still potentially be quite a major short-term problem. Then obviously controlling how your vessels move around as well to make sure you haven't got a vessel collision issue. And automated detection and curtailment for priority bird species is also becoming feasible. So modern offshore wind turbines have an amazing array of sensors that they're now fitted with that allow a lot of ongoing monitoring of what's happening around the turbines, including detection of collisions potentially. So although I think there's a little way to go, we can imagine an automated approach to monitoring and potentially curtailment being the norm in the very near future. And not to forget the transmission and distribution lines. Again, transmission lines are the key thing for most wind and solar energy. Distribution lines, which are the low, medium voltage lines, kill an awful lot of birds through electrocution if they're not properly planned. So where they're part of the project, that's important to consider too. And the key thing is to keep these away from where birds are going to be flying into them, essentially, and to make sure that they're well marked to reduce the risk of birds not seeing that top line. Again, that doesn't work too well for some species like buzzards that just don't seem to be able to detect the top line or get out of the way in time. But the best approach is to try and keep out of their habitat in the first place, or if you have no other choice, to bury the power line, which is quite effective, but also quite expensive, unfortunately. So moving on to offsets and enhancements. Offsets are the last resort in the mitigation hierarchy. You want to do all you can not to have to do an offset, because they're often quite challenging to implement, expensive as well, and uncertain in the outcomes. But essentially, you can do things in a couple of ways. Reducing threats to species elsewhere, for example, by retrofitting non-project power lines to prevent electrocutions, or by improving the condition of habitat that's been degraded for other reasons, not because of the project. Here's an example in South Africa where the offset is to restore these areas of Vernosterbe veld, which is a fynbos habitat of native species in a large agricultural landscape. These patches have been degraded and reduced in size. So by improving those areas, restoring them, you create nesting opportunities, feeding opportunities for these endangered birds of prey. It's also a way of keeping them out of the wind farms because they're then not attracted in because they have better habitat to forage in outside. Another example for Capetto again, where the offset is addressing one of the major problems for vultures in southern Kenya and indeed in much of Africa now, which is incidental poisoning. Vultures are falling victim to poisoning of carcasses to control problem animals, lions and leopards and hyenas that are taking people's livestock. It's a retaliation, but the vultures are the unintended victims, and it's a very major cause of mortality for these highly threatened birds. So Capetto is supporting, as part of a bigger program, several NGO partners and Kenya Wildlife Service to implement a very large and focused community engagement program that includes a lot of education work and information gathering and rapid response, and also trying to rescue and rehabilitate vultures if they are poisoned and can be saved, as well as a strong research element on satellite tagging and tracking, so we can keep track of what's happening to birds and how their mortality rates are changing over time. But it's complicated and expensive. Better if you didn't have to do it in the first place because you had no impacts on the birds. Because of their spatial layout, there's also a lot of opportunity for doing good things on site with wind and solar projects. Obviously, the assumption there is you're building them on a degraded area to begin with, rather than converting good natural habitat. But you can do a lot to increase the biodiversity on site, and if you wish to, also practically do things off-site in the wider landscape to support conservation interventions. These so-called proactive conservation actions, or PCAs, are not offsets because they're not producing measurable outcomes that can be set against your impacts, but they're good things to do. They demonstrate good environmental stewardship to keep stakeholders on board. They meet nature positive commitments if you have them, and they can sometimes be important for facilitating offset success as well by creating the broader enabling environment. A few examples of on-site enhancement. Flower meadows are becoming increasingly popular in this part of the world, in Europe, where often solar farms are built on, say, degraded grassland or pasture. And offshore, because of the habitat that you're creating, there's a lot of opportunity for doing interesting things on the seabed, again, where it's degraded in this part of the North Sea in the Netherlands, where they're putting in flat oyster tables. And they're researching also what the best structural attributes are for the wind turbine basis, so they can maximize the benefits of the biodiversity that comes into these new created habitats. So an interesting ongoing area of research and activity. Just a couple of examples I won't go into in detail, where some of the partners we worked with on the guidance are working with a bunch of stakeholders, in this case in the landscape in Portugal, looking at Iberian wolf conservation around a whole range of wind farms. And in this case, looking at Montague's harrier conservation in France, again, around various wind farms to try and make sure that they reduce the risk of these harriers in the surrounding farmland. It's really important, if you have concerns about potential impacts, to monitor what's going on. And there's quite a specialized set of technical requirements for monitoring fatalities at wind farms in particular, because of the likelihood that you don't spot everything. You won't detect all the carcasses the fatalities that fall to the ground. Some of those will also disappear over time before you can find them. So you need to account for that using trials to get your correction factors and the right statistical programs, and also have an appropriately timed and focused set of monitoring going on, so you can make some sensible decisions about what's happening. And again, what is not happening, unfortunately, nearly enough, but is in some places like South Africa, which is showing a good example to the world, is reporting and sharing of data. The information base on which species are at risk and on what the fatalities actually are at wind farms is so important to strengthen as we plan in farms in new places. Then we understand better what the risks are, how to avoid them, and also can keep track of cumulative impacts. So there's a real imperative to try to promote data sharing, often quite difficult to do because it's seen as sensitive, but really key for the sustainability of this technology moving forward. And just to mention very briefly the need for end-of-life planning as well. Repowering, where you put replacement turbines in, can help address some of the risks that you've seen in the operations. And you obviously want to try to make sure the site is left better than before. In some cases, this might involve leaving your turbine basis in place in the offshore context to make sure the benefits that have accrued through new habitat and colonization by new biodiversity are maintained. So I'll finish with just a few general thoughts on actions that can be taken by a whole range of stakeholders. I'm sure there's a variety of people on the call today, from NGOs, governments, banks, and developers. How can they collectively support nature positive wind and solar energy upscaling? Really important to have stakeholder and industry forums to share experience and lessons learned and make sure we keep on learning and doing a better job. Promote data sharing, as I mentioned, to improve the evidence base. Make sure that we do have good sensitivity mapping and strategic level planning using the best available information, and actually do this by design rather than just in an ad hoc way. Make sure that evolving good international practice is applied, and that's also reflected in regulatory standards and guidance. As a cornerstone of the process, make sure the mitigation hierarchy is implemented rigorously. If you do have to have offsets, try to ensure that they're not, again, done ad hoc, but they contribute to identify conservation priorities and targets in your jurisdiction. Do what you can to pursue opportunities for enhancement on-site and off-site. And importantly, work to improve traceability of materials you're using, reduce supply chain impacts, and recycle what's left at the end of the project life. And underlying this, there's real need in many parts of the world to support policy and regulation reform, and especially in the developing world, to support technical and institutional capacity development. That's my last slide. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm happy to answer some questions, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Leon, for a fantastic and information-packed presentation. We've got some questions that have already come in, which I will bring up now and maybe pull a few of those together. For those listening, please do feel free to continue to add questions into the chat function at the side. One thing that you touched on early in your presentation, but perhaps could be explored a little bit further, was some of the issues associated with induced access with renewable energy developments. Do you want to maybe expand on that a little bit?
Thank you, Owen. So it's probably less of a problem for many renewable projects themselves than it is for, say, mines, just because they're at smaller scale and tend to have less of a local economic impact. It is a major issue for the material sourcing, and we do see this problem at some wind and solar projects too. So going back to Kipeto in Kenya, it's a very important project for the community. They're getting a share of the proceeds and also some rent for their land. That has increased the amount of economic activity. People are wealthier, they have new houses. It's also led to some new roads being built, and we are seeing people moving in and cutting down trees, producing charcoal, as well as increasing the number of livestock. So the pressure on natural habitat is increasing. This kind of thing is often not really well considered in environmental assessments and in mitigation plans, but something to keep a close eye on. Again, the effects are likely to be less substantial where you're working in an already degraded area than in semi-natural habitat as a Kipeto. But it's very context specific. There are ways to manage it, but it does require, again, really good engagement from a range of stakeholders, especially local and national government often, which isn't always that easy to do.
Thanks. Another one which popped up fairly early on, with just a small technical question. A slide mentioned lake effect of solar farms, and the listener was looking for clarification on what is that lake effect?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I think I skipped over that without explaining it, which wasn't very helpful. So the idea is that where you have a large block of solar panels, for some wildlife, birds and insects in particular that are overflying, the reflection off those panels can look like it's a body of water and attract the wildlife down. So it does seem to happen, but it doesn't seem to be a very major and significant impact. It's not really that well documented, I have to say, but I think that's because it has turned out to be a fairly insignificant effect overall. So it might be something to consider if you're putting your installation on a migratory route or close to an existing water body, but fortunately it doesn't seem to be a major problem for wildlife on the whole with solar at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a scaled up version of those beetles that land on the windscreen of your car on a sunny day.
Exactly, exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a question around the impacts of solar installations on native vegetation with particular reference to arid and grassland ecosystems. Are you aware of research that's been done or impacts that have been monitored, particularly around the impacts of shading and water balance on that native vegetation?
Yes, great question. So there is research, especially from southwestern US, on the impacts of solar farms, both in terms of clearing and in terms of shading, and I think some other parts of the world too. So a bit like putting your offshore wind in place, it creates a mix of negatives and positives potentially. So it's obviously not a good thing if you're having to clear native vegetation, but the shading can create refuges for some species, and even improve conditions for some plants. So it's a question of understanding what's likely to happen and then working out how you make the best of it, as it were. So maximize the positives and minimize the negatives. But again, we need much more research. It's very context specific. And without understanding the ecology of an area quite well and seeing what the effects of shading are already in that landscape, it may be difficult to make a prediction without that detailed ecological knowledge to begin with.
And Helena's just followed up on that, asking if we point to some of those references for the US work, and Helena will perhaps follow up with you out of session on that with some references.
But by all means, there may be some in the IUCN document already, but I can have a look for others. There definitely are some out there.
Thanks. One point here, seeking some clarification between the PCAs that you talked about and what were being termed out of kind or non-like-for-like offsets. Any commentary on the differences or alignment between those two sort of categories of action?
Sure. So PCAs are also sometimes called additional conservation actions. They're all quite clunky terms, actually. I'm probably going to come with a better way of describing them. But I would describe them generally as good things to do that don't directly address your impacts. So offsets are measurable or interventions that have measurable outcomes that do address your impacts in the sense of compensating for your impacts. So offsets would usually address the impacts on the same things that you're impacting. So if you're impacting a large eagle or impacting a whale, you'd want to make sure your offset was improving conditions for those species elsewhere. But in some circumstances, offsets can also be not like for like or out of kind. Again, this is a controversial area where there isn't that much experience yet as to what is acceptable and what works. But the basic idea would be that you're impacting biodiversity that's a relatively low value. So perhaps you're putting your solar farm down on some semi-natural scrubland that isn't particularly high biodiversity value, but you'd be having your offset conserving a nice piece of a different habitat that's really important for conservation. That would be the general principle behind it. But it's something that not all stakeholders are happy with, and it's one of those complex conservation issues where it may be good for conservation nationally or globally, isn't necessarily maintaining what your stakeholders expect locally, including ecosystem services from the biodiversity around them. And those would include recreation and aesthetics, for example, not as other things. So it's a complex issue, but a simple idea. You basically trade up poor value biodiversity for higher value biodiversity in your offset.
On a different tack, many of these technologies are being implemented as part of a carbon leaning strategy or a decarbonization strategy, and we've got a question around the use of nuclear technologies and whether in any of this work nuclear was considered with that growth in demand for nuclear as a carbon lean, but not renewable.
So the work with WWF is not looking at nuclear because that's part of their policy approach. You can look at nuclear in life cycle terms in just the same way as you can other technologies, and it is included in a number of life cycle analyses. I can't remember the detailed results, But I think the issues around nuclear in terms of the impacts are obviously partly down to extraction of the materials you need to run the nuclear power plant, the footprint, and then the disposal of the waste long term, which has been the biggest practical problem so far. So I have my personal views on this, but nuclear is a very controversial and charged topic, so maybe not the best thing to discuss today. I'll be surprised personally if there isn't a strong nuclear element to the global energy mix going forwards. But I think it looks clear that wind and solar will probably be the predominant new technologies that we're seeing in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Thanks. Another sort of leaning towards the technical end of questions. You mentioned lithium extraction as an emerging risk, and there's been a couple of questions around alternatives to lithium-ion batteries for storage. And I mean, that does verge off into the engineering technical, but perhaps a brief comment there.
Thanks, Sonia. I'm definitely not an engineer, but my understanding is that there's a large number of potential new technologies out there for storage using different elements, which are in rapid development at the moment. It seems difficult to tell which ones are likely to be able to scale up. It still seems to be a very fast evolving area. I guess as with the wind power designs, we can't assume that the technologies will come along fast enough to provide the solutions in the near future. So I would imagine they're likely to be helpful in 5, 10, 15 years to come, rather than the next half decade.
No, just add to that comment that for those who are interested in battery technologies, particularly, there's a collaborative research centre based here in Western Australia, the Advanced Batteries CRC. So Google them, and they've got lots of very exciting innovation in that space to follow up on. Just skimming through what I've captured here and other aspects. I think that we could perhaps wrap it up there. Maybe there's, we've got one more has popped in around offsets, especially in African countries. It's moved on my screen, so I tried to read it and summarize at the same time. Yeah, global expansion of renewables, what can be done to encourage adoption of biodiversity offsets into policies, particularly in the African context where this is still much resistance to offsets?
I'm not sure there's much resistance to offsets. I think that they're not always been thought about, but there are a number of initiatives underway to try to develop offset policy in Africa. The so-called Combo program, which has been led by WCS, has been working in 4 or 5 African countries, and there's major advances in places like Mozambique and Uganda, for example, in terms of setting national offset frameworks and developing criteria and standards for offsets. I think there's a huge amount of potential to do this right. It does seem difficult for countries to learn from the experiences elsewhere and what's gone wrong. They don't always want to learn those lessons. And the biggest problem, probably apart from getting the right policy in place, is the capacity, including the underlying information base, but also the national capacity to assess offsets, implement and monitor them. But I think there's a lot going on. So I don't personally feel that African governments are resisting offsets. It's just that they have a lot of other things on their plate at the same time. And these things all have to be mainstreamed alongside all the other environmental issues that need to be taken care of.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting balancing act for countries with multiple challenges facing them on many fronts. Thank you, Leon, for your presentation and your willingness to answer questions and discuss. And thank you to our participants for their active engagement in the questioning. Hopefully, I've captured the main themes that have emerged in the discussion. And if your question was missed, I do apologize. They move up the screen fairly quickly while we're talking here, so that's going to be my excuse now. I'll stick to it. I wasn't filtering it out. So that draws to a close today's webinar. I would like to encourage you all to mark your calendars for our next webinar, which is scheduled for June 16th. A great opportunity with Liz O'Leary, one of the members of the TNFD task force working globally on natural capital and nature-based risk disclosure in the financial sector. Liz is one of 30 or so people on that panel for the UN and will be our speaker on TNFD and natural capital and the emerging, again, challenges and opportunities in that realm on the 16th of June. So I look forward to having your company again then. Thank you.
Thanks so much, all. Great to talk to you all. Bye-bye.